This learning video focuses on the PAISA survey processes and highlights the key steps and challenges that should be considered when you're conducting your own fund tracking survey. In 2009, AI launched the Planning, Allocations and Expenditures Studies and Accountability Project, which is abbreviated as PAISA. PAISA is an exercise in engaging citizens in tracking expenditures and getting them to participate in governance processes. In some ways, it's a people's audit of governance processes. PAISA follows a three-pronged approach. First, we focus on building evidence. AI conducts different types of research on public service delivery systems. The research focuses on understanding state capabilities and accountability systems by tracking the planning, budgeting, and decision-making structures of social sector schemes such as the ICDS or the Integrated Child Development Services, the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, midday meal scheme, or even understanding finances in local governments such as panchayats. Next, having built the evidence, it's important to disseminate the information across different stakeholders. Underlying AI's work is thus a strong commitment to the idea that enhanced citizen engagement in governance processes are a primary driver of change. AI leverages its research to deepen public debate by promoting public discussion through seminars, discussion in the media, and proactive engagement with government at different levels. Finally, in order to move from evidence to action, catalyzing change forms a third approach. Under this, we try to use the research and learning products to do a number of different activities, from seeking out partnerships to pilot models for citizen-led accountability, to training a new generation of public finance experts and promoting administrative reforms at the front lines of service delivery. This learning video will focus on the building evidence component of PAISA, and within it specifically the use of citizen-led public tracking surveys. In 2009, AI partnered with the ASER Centre to conduct India's first national citizen-led public tracking surveys for education in order to understand whether schools receive their grants. This is known as the PAISA National Studies. This was followed by a more detailed deep dive into trying to understand fund flows right from when it leaves the Government of India coffers down to when it reaches the schools. These studies were known as PAISA District Studies. This video will discuss the methods of conducting both types of surveys. In order to understand a participatory expenditure tracking survey, the following 6 steps need to be taken. First is to understand the problem. Next, one needs to define the research question. Third, the research question needs to be refined further. Step 4 is experiments or piloting the questions. Fifth is survey. And finally, scale. It's important to note that these steps are not always linear, as at times, during the process of either refining research questions or experimentation, one may need to go back to redefine the question itself. Using the example of elementary education, we will walk through each of these steps. Specifically, we will focus on unpacking how to do a PETS if you want to do a PAISA survey for the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan scheme. Understanding the problem. When we started out in 2010, the Right to Education Act had just been implemented. The implementation of the Act was accompanied with significant increases in resources. Yet, as ASER pointed out year on year, learning levels continued to be extremely low. In 2009, only 53% of children studying in Standard 5 could read a Standard 2 level text. There was clearly a significant gap between outlays and outcomes. The next step was then to define the research questions. Given this context, we wanted to understand, are we allocating the right resources to the right activities? How do funds flow? How are expenditure decisions made? Is money reaching its desired destination? What are the information or capacity constraints on the ground? But these are very broad questions. The next step is thus refining the research questions. Specifically, we wanted to track a very simple thing. Did schools get their money? If yes, when? Did they spend their money? If yes, when and on what? And did these spendings reflect needs on the ground? These questions were simple enough that they could be replicated across sectors. In fact, we did other studies using the same framework, such as the midday meal scheme study, a study on tracking Janani Suraksha Yojana, a cash incentive to promote safe and institutional delivery, and a study of funds reaching panchayats or local government. Before starting a survey, the next major step is piloting. Piloting is key as it gives a sense of the viability and correct framing of the questions, as well as gives a sense of the answers one gets. In other words, are we getting the expected answers to the question, or should we rephrase it? Is the flow of questions correct? How much information should we seek, etc.? Piloting thus forms the next important step. We undertook a number of different pilots across areas. First, we held focus group discussions to understand the main issues present. Next, in Nalanda district of Bihar, we did a small pilot in 100 schools in one district and asked basic questions to headmasters on 3 to 4 core grants that reach schools. The information provided was based on recall. Finally, in order to ensure the veracity of the information provided, we undertook an even smaller pilot in 50 schools in one district of Bihar, namely Purnia. In this, we not only extended the scope to include more grants, but more importantly, asked to see cash books and passbooks to ensure that the information provided could be verified via documentation. The piloting process often results in having to go back to the drawing board. Mostly it helps in refining the research question, but at times it even results in redefining the research question. Were we asking the right questions in the first place? Having finalized the questions in the survey tool, the next step is actually conducting the survey. Our core mission was to get citizens to participate in the data collection process. Thus, surveyors could not be hired from a survey agency firm, but instead mobilized from within the community. However, given the scale, one could not centralize the training process either. We thus identified master trainers. These master trainers were then in charge of training, and efforts were made to ensure not only content knowledge but also their skills as trainers themselves. Next, we mobilized citizen volunteers. For this, we relied mostly on district colleges, other NGOs, and other community level organizations. A 3-day training workshop was conducted with these volunteers, and through a number of different tools, from posters, PPTs, mock training, or videos, we gave training on how to introduce oneself, conduct oneself during the interview process, the use of the tool, how to ask the question, and finally how to fill responses. Finally, we created process monitoring formats to ensure adequate monitoring and rechecks of the data collected. This model was what we used in the PAISA national studies. When we went back to our initial research question, we realized the need to also track the flow of all funds to schools. But if one wants to deepen the research by tracking more grants in more places, one needs to increase the scale, which entails greater time and resources. The additional steps required for this were: A. Building an army of fiscal detectives. We hired people at the district level, conducted a course in the basics of fiscal federalism and decentralization. B. We increased contacts with government, got permission from them to do the survey, and collected a lot of secondary data and other documentation from the government itself. C. We focused more on hiring the right people, building our expertise through hiring statisticians, budget experts, and other advisors. And finally, of course, we did a lot more pilots. All of this eventually led to the PAISA district studies. Now that we've gone over the process, here are a few tips. Principle 1. Pick a lens to understand the problem. Is it an allocation question? Is it a question of not getting enough? Is it an efficiency question or process-related question? Is it a leakage question of capturing corruption? Is it an outcome question, such as outcome monitoring? In our case, it was an efficiency question that we were focusing on. Principle 2. Peel the onion to get to the bottom of the issue. What are the role of different levels in fund flows? What is the total budget? Identify the flow of funds. Identify the core grants that you want to track. Principle 3. Do the groundwork to assess the perceived problems on the ground. When we first started out, we went to headmasters to ask them the 1 lakh question. It was a simple enough question. Ask headmasters, if you're given 1 lakh in your school, how would you spend it? Next, we had to help them break it down. So if you say that you'll spend on furniture, how much of that 1 lakh would you spend on furniture? If you say you want to spend on girls' toilets, how much of that would you spend on the girls' toilets, etc. The idea behind this was to try and understand that if a school could prioritize its own plans according to its needs, what were its main constraints? What were its main priorities or needs? Principle 4. Start small. It's always useful to track something that is doable, that is meaningful, and most importantly, that is actionable. When we started working on education sector, or even if one focuses on SSA alone, there were a number of grants that we could track. However, we decided to focus on the three core school grants that come to a school every single year: the school development grant, the school maintenance grant, and the teaching learning material. The reason for tracking these three grants were: A, they were annual grants and as a result could be tracked across schools, across states, across the country. Second, they were basic grants, useful for the day-to-day functioning of the school and thus of importance. And finally, these were the three grants that the school management committee had discretion over expenditure decisions. However, we did face a number of challenges when we started the process of conducting a PET survey. These pertain to finding the right resource people, finding and mobilizing volunteers, occasional resistance from government or even respondents, dissemination that is relevant for the audience, and finally, lack of government documentation and record keeping. As you embark on your own PETS journey, it may be useful to keep these challenges in mind. All the best and good luck, and feel free to reach out to us at info@accountabilityindia.org.